When you walk through the old alleyways of York, when the cobblestones whisper stories beneath your feet, have you ever wondered who lived here long before we came? How could a small island on the edge of Europe shape the world so profoundly? And where exactly does England actually begin? Behind symbols like the British pound, London, or a cup of tea hides something much more complex. A long chain of conquest, collapse, rebirth, and cultural fusion. And this story does not begin with a crown, but on mist-shrouded hills where Celtic tribes set up their camps, where Druids whispered to the trees, and where Rome dreamed of the light of civilization. Today we take you on a journey through over 2,000 years of history, from nameless warriors to royal women without a throne. Step by step, you will realize that England is not just a country, it is a story of power and loss, of language and faith, of strangers who created an identity together. Soon you will encounter personalities who changed the course of Europe not through weapons, but through visions. You will understand why an Anglo-Saxon smith left traces in our language, and why a king's failed marriage triggered a cultural revolution. All of this begins where many do not even look, with the forgotten Celtic roots and the stories that were never written down. Come with us in search of England, not as a superpower, but as a soul shaped by time. If we think of England today, we see castles, monarchs, tea ceremonies, and red phone booths. But long before the first Roman legionary set foot on the British Isle, people already lived here. Not savages as later chroniclers like to portray them, but complex communities with their own order, their gods, and their memories. The earliest roots of England reach back into the world of the Celts, a culture that once shaped large parts of Europe, and whose traces still slumber deep beneath English soil. The Celtic tribes that inhabited the territory of today's England were not a unified nation, but loosely connected groups with shared beliefs, similar languages, and a deep understanding of nature and the rhythm of the seasons. They lived in agriculturally organized settlements, traded with the European mainland, and built impressive fortifications like today's Maiden Castle in Dorset, a place that still radiates the power of that time. What made Celtic society special was its spiritual leadership class, the Druids. Unlike in Rome or Greece, these men, and occasionally women, were not just religious leaders, but simultaneously judges, storytellers, healers, teachers, and political advisors. They kept knowledge alive not through books, but through memory, song, and ritual transmission. Pliny the Elder once wrote that the Druids believed written knowledge weakened the memory, a reason why hardly any written records from Celtic hands remain today. Instead, it is Roman sources that tell us much about the Celts. Sources, however, colored by the lens of the conquerors. Thus, the image of the barbaric Briton persisted for a long time, although archaeological finds speak a different language. Fine metalwork, artistically crafted brooches, trade relations reaching into the Mediterranean. These cultures were not primitive, they were just different. And precisely in this otherness lies a key to understanding England, for before it was English it was Celtic. A common error is to start the history of England only with the Roman conquest or even with the Anglo-Saxons. But that means blocking out the cultural roots of an entire people. Even today, the Celtic lives on in Great Britain, in the language of the Welsh, in the myths of Cornwall, in the stone circles older than any church. Whoever wants to understand England must begin with the Celts, for here the stage was set for conquests, resistance, and change. And exactly here, this first look back does not end, but leads us directly to the next great wave that would change the face of the island forever, the Roman expansion. When Roman troops under Emperor Claudius landed on the coast of Britain in 43 AD, it was not the first time Rome had cast its eye on the island. Julius Caesar had already undertaken 2 campaigns about 90 years earlier, without lasting success. But now it was to become serious. With around 40,000 soldiers, an invasion began that led Britain into a new era, an era that sparks debates to this day. Was this the beginning of civilization or simply a military occupation? For the Romans, Britain was a rough diamond, rich in tin, lead, slaves, and prestige. But the political background was just as important. Claudius, a hitherto underestimated ruler, wanted to profile himself as a strong emperor. A successful campaign to Britain, where even Caesar had failed, was to bring him glory, and he succeeded. The entry into the city of Camulodunum, today Colchester, with war elephants at his side, became a propaganda show. But behind the shine of Roman triumphal arches began a reality that was more ambivalent. The Romans undoubtedly brought order, roads, aqueducts, new cities like Londinium, today London, and a written administration. For many tribes, this meant access to interregional trade, a monetary economy, and medical knowledge for the first time. Britain was spun into the web of the empire, not only geographically but also culturally. But this transformation was not voluntary. The resistance of the native population remained fierce. Above all, the rebellion of Queen Boudicca in 60 AD, whose troops burned down Roman cities and killed thousands. Her story remains a symbol of the Celtic world's drive for freedom, and of the pain that the loss of one's own sovereignty brings. The Roman period is often portrayed as the beginning of civilization on the island. But this term is dangerous, for it evaluates from the victor's perspective. Celtic culture was by no means uncivilized. It was different, more connected to nature, oral instead of written, communal instead of hierarchical. The mistake of many historical narratives lies in setting Rome as the measure of all things, and yet the Romans left lasting traces. The Roman road network shaped England's traffic routes for centuries. The Latin language flowed indirectly into later Old English, and with Christianity, they brought a new worldview that was to take deep roots. But no empire lasts forever. When the last Roman troops withdrew in 410 AD and Rome itself broke apart under the pressure of Germanic peoples, Britain was suddenly left to itself, without protection, without a center, without a clear tomorrow. What followed was not a return to the past, but a chaotic yet fascinating new beginning. Old structures crumbled. New actors entered the stage from the north, from the east, from the interior. And exactly there begins our next chapter, in a forgotten interim time when Britain had to reinvent itself. It did not happen with a bang, but in a long, painful exhalation of history. In the year 410 AD, the desperate British elite sent a final plea to Rome: "Come back, help us." But the answer from Emperor Honorius was brief and final. The province of Britain must defend itself. Rome had other worries. The empire was about to collapse, plagued by internal power struggles and Germanic invasions. For Britain, this meant being alone. But what happens to a land whose structure was Roman, influenced for over 350 years, when suddenly all symbols of order disappear? Unlike many think, Britain did not fall into complete chaos. The Roman roads remained, as did many of the cities, markets, and forms of administration. Even the aristocratic families who held positions of power under Roman rule continued their role, at least for a time. People continued to speak Latin. They organized themselves militarily according to the Roman model, and many held on to Christianity, which had taken root since the 4th century. But the balance was fragile. More and more attacks hit the island. From the north, the Picts; from the west, the Irish. To protect themselves, some British leaders resorted to a seemingly logical step. They hired mercenaries. Germanic warriors from the area of today's northern Germany, Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, who had already had contact with the Romans, were invited to defend the land, and they came, first in small groups, then in streams. What was intended as protection soon became a threat, for the mercenaries quickly realized this land was fertile, barely protected, and there was space. Soon they began to settle permanently, and where they were initially called as helpers, they became masters. A momentous mistake and a classic example of how short-term solutions can entail long-term consequences. The British resistance against the Saxon expansion crystallized around figures like Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Roman-influenced Britain considered the last representative of the old order. In this time, the first myths arise around a mysterious warrior named Arthur, not as a king, as we later romanticize him, but likely as a leader of a desperate defensive struggle. Whether he really existed remains uncertain. But the need for an identity-establishing figure was real. This transition period between Rome and Anglo-Saxon England is often skipped, almost forgotten, perhaps because it left no glamorous emperors, no magnificent buildings, no chroniclers. But precisely in this void something new formed, a cultural upheaval, a struggle for identity, a mixture of memory and adaptation. And that is exactly where we pick up next, with those who once came as mercenaries and finally shaped the island like hardly anyone before, the Anglo-Saxons. Imagine a land that has just lost its shield, a land with Roman roads but without Roman legions. The people who once lived under the eagles of the empire suddenly stood alone, surrounded by threats and without a clear center. In this situation, the arrivals from the north of Europe seemed like a hope and soon became a challenge. The Anglo-Saxons, a collective term for various Germanic groups like the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians, did not come all at once. Their arrival was a process over decades, partly peaceful, partly violent, partly invited, partly forced. In the chronicles of later times, it often sounds like a dramatic invasion of barbarians who burned everything down. But archaeology tells a more nuanced story. There were military conflicts, no question. Battles like the legendary one of Mons Badonicus, presumably around 500 AD, show the bitter resistance of the native Britons. But there were equally long phases of coexistence, of trade, even of integration. Anglo-Saxon settlements often arose next to Celtic villages, and from the mixing of both cultures, a new society grew with its own language, religion, and social structure. A common misunderstanding is to view the Anglo-Saxon period as a complete break with the Roman past. But many Anglo-Saxon leaders adopted Roman administrative models, used existing infrastructure, and engaged with Christianity, initially hesitantly, later all the more decisively. At the same time, the memory of Rome remained alive in titles like dux, in architectural forms, in dress and law. Whether migration or invasion, the truth lies in between. It was both. And that is crucial for understanding English identity. England was not born in a moment, but in a long process of change. The old Britons did not disappear overnight. Many of them adapted, took Germanic names, married into new families, and became part of a different cultural narrative. An often underestimated aspect is language. The Old English that developed in this time was not a pure Germanic language, but already interspersed with Celtic, Latin, and soon also Norse influences. In the language, what happened in the land itself was mirror-read fusion through encounter, not through erasure. The lesson from this time is clear: history is rarely black and white. It is a web of paths that cross, of voices that mix, and of people who, despite all differences, search for home. And exactly there, history leads us further to a man who emerged from these turbulent times and opened a new chapter for the island, Alfred, who would later be called the Great. Sometimes it is not the largest armies or the richest empires that write history, but a single individual who finds the courage to bring light in dark times. Alfred of Wessex, born in the year 80-49, was the youngest son of his father, a child hardly anyone had intended for the crown, and yet he became the architect of a New England, not because he conquered it, but because he saved it. When Alfred ascended the throne, his world was in decay. The Vikings, warlike seafarers from Denmark, had already occupied large parts of England, the so-called Danelaw. Entire kingdoms like Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia were under their control. Only a small strip of land in the southwest, Wessex, still held out, and that only with its last strength. Alfred faced a choice: surrender or fight, but he decided on a third option: resist wisely. After heavy defeats and a dramatic retreat into the marshes of Athelney, Alfred gathered his remaining troops and struck back in 878 in the Battle of Edington. He defeated the Viking king Guthrum, forced him to be baptized, and at the same time negotiated a peace treaty that left room for stability. But Alfred's greatness lay not only in the military. He understood that you hold a country not only with swords, but with education, law, and identity. He had schools founded, ensured the translation of Latin texts into Old English, reformed the legal system, and created a network of fortresses that served as defensive lines and administrative centers, so-called burhs. Many of these are still town centers of modern places today. An often overlooked aspect is Alfred's capacity for synthesis. He united Christianity with Anglo-Saxon tradition. He combined Roman legal thought with Germanic practice, and he tried to form a common thought out of the many crumbled kingdoms, not just a territory, but a consciousness, Anglo-Saxon, or England. A mistake many make is to see Alfred only as a war hero, but his vision was more far-reaching. He was not the king who subjugated everything, but the one who created structures upon which others could build. Therefore, he is called to this day the only English king with the epithet, the Great. His legacy an island that could breathe again, not through rule, but through order, through language, through learning. And perhaps that is the most beautiful form of greatness, not to rule, but to enable. But while Alfred strengthened Wessex and laid the foundations for a unified England, a new threat grew in the north, a power from abroad that would soon shake the history of the island once more. The Vikings came back, and this time they wanted more than just loot. It was a morning in the year 793 when the monks of Lindisfarne, a peaceful monastery island on the northeast coast of England, were suddenly visited by a storm of fire and metal. Men with axes and a strange language fell upon them. They plundered, murdered, and disappeared again across the sea. This event marked the beginning of a new era, the Viking Age in England. But what began with isolated raids soon developed into a profound upheaval. From the late 9th century, the Danes came no longer just as pirates, but in organized armies with families, settlement plans, and political ambitions. They wanted more than silver. They wanted land, influence, a piece of England. A decisive turning point was the year 865, when the so-called Great Heathen Army, under the leadership of Danish warlords like Ivar the Boneless and Ubba, entered the island. It was not a spontaneous raid, but a military operation with strategy, resources, and a goal: the systematic capture of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Within a few years, Northumbria, East Anglia, and large parts of Mercia fell. Wessex under Alfred the Great remained as the last bastion. But even after Alfred's death in 899, the Danish influence was not banished. The Vikings controlled large parts of the country. The so-called Danelaw, an area with its own jurisdiction, its own laws, and Danish culture. Cities like York or Jorvik blossomed under their rule, shaped by trade, shipping, and craftsmanship. An often overlooked aspect is the cultural mixing. Many Danes not only stayed but married local women, were baptized, learned the language, and became part of the Anglo-Saxon world. One finds place names in northern England to this day with endings like by, Thorpe, or Thwaite, silent witnesses of Scandinavian presence. The mistake of many depictions lies in seeing the Vikings exclusively as destroyers. They were undoubtedly brutal, yet equally organized, adaptable, and economically active. Their trade networks reached from Ireland to the Caspian Sea, and their political structures were by no means primitive. England learned much from them about seafaring, about decentralized power, about pragmatism and faith. When the Vikings finally conquered all of England under King Cnut in the year 1016, it was no longer foreign rule in the classical sense. It was a Scandinavian-English dual identity. Cnut ruled over a North Sea empire that encompassed England, Denmark, and Norway, and spoke just as well with the Pope as with his jarls. The lesson from this time: identity is malleable, and power changes not only through swords but also through language, daily life, marriage, and trade. But hardly had England arranged itself with the Danes when the next wave came, this time not from the north, but from the continent. A new power armed itself for invasion, and it was to end Anglo-Saxon England forever. The Normans. It was October 14, 1066, a day that began seemingly unremarkably, yet was to change England forever. On a hill near the town of Hastings, two men met who both laid claim to the same throne. Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon king, and William, Duke of Normandy. What followed was no ordinary battle, but a cultural landslide that catapulted the island from the Germanic into the Romanesque age. Harold had been crowned king only a few months earlier, after the death of Edward the Confessor, who had left no direct heir. William, however, claimed Edward had once promised him the crown, a promise that had been confirmed by Harold's alleged oath. Whether that is true remains disputed to this day. What is certain is only that William equipped an army, crossed the English Channel with ships, and landed in southern England. But Harold had just warded off another threat. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, had been defeated a few weeks earlier at Stamford Bridge in a battle that exhausted the English troops, and so Harold marched in all haste to the south to confront William. The two armies met on Senlac Hill, Anglo-Saxons with their shield wall, Normans with mounted knights and archers. The fight raged for hours. Only through a tactical trick, a feigned retreat, did William succeed in breaking Harold's line. The English king fell, probably by an arrow in the eye. With him fell an entire epoch, the Anglo-Saxon era. What came after was more than a change of throne. It was a cultural break. The Norman upper class took over land, offices, churches, and language. French became the language of the court, Latin the language of administration. Old English, however, sank to the language of the common people. But with time, the languages merged. Many terms in our English today, like justice, government, beef, stem from the French. A common error is to see Hastings only as a military episode, but its actual effect lay in the silent, profound transformation. The Normans introduced a new architecture, stone castles like the Tower of London. They reformed the church and, with the Domesday Book, conducted the first comprehensive census. England was administered like an estate, not like a kingdom of the old stamp. The lesson: not every conquest ends with destruction. Some begin with structure and leave traces that outlast centuries. But while the Normans reshaped the Anglo-Saxon heritage, something else emerged in secret, a thought of accountability, of order through law, of power that must not be infinite. And exactly there the next chapter leads us, to the Magna Carta. It was a summer in the year 1215, when a scene played out on a meadow near Runnymede that would later often be celebrated as the birth moment of Western freedom. A King John Lackland sat opposite an army of dissatisfied barons. No battlefield, no trail of blood, but a document, an agreement, a signature. The Magna Carta was born. But what was it really? A milestone of democracy, or just a desperate compromise between power and mistrust? John, youngest son of Henry and brother of Richard the Lionheart, was not a beloved monarch. He lost large parts of the Angevin Empire in France, ruined the state treasury with unsuccessful campaigns, and tried to secure his authority through arbitrary taxes and harsh justice. Even the church turned against him. Pope Innocent III excommunicated him temporarily. The barons, increasingly humiliated by his measures, rose up. But instead of open war, it came to negotiations. The result was the Magna Carta Libertatum, the Great Charter of Liberties. It contained 61 articles, many of them technical and tailored to the interests of the nobility: protection against arbitrary expropriation, the right to fair legal proceedings, limitation of royal tax power. Article 39 became particularly famous: no free man shall be arrested, imprisoned, or dispossessed, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. But the romantic idea that the Magna Carta was a constitution for everyone falls short. It applied only to a fraction of the population, to free men, not to serfs or women. And John never intended to keep to it. A few weeks after the signing, he had the charter declared invalid by the Pope. The Civil War began. Only his death in 1216 and the weakness of his successor Henry III led to later versions of the Magna Carta being confirmed again and partially adopted into laws. Nevertheless, its symbolic value was immense. For the first time, an English king was forced to limit his power in writing, not by divine right, but by negotiable rights. It became the foundation for later developments: the Parliament, the Bill of Rights, the American Constitution. A common mistake is to interpret the Magna Carta as a sudden awakening of democracy. Rather, it was the first stone on a long, rocky path, a compromise that became a habit. And exactly that is its strength. Freedom often begins not with revolution, but with a signature under reluctance. But while the idea of accountability slowly anchored itself in politics, a new figure formed in the South. A king, tall, determined, and full of ambition. Edward I was to come, and with him a new will to power. It begins with an inheritance, or rather with a dispute over it. When the French King Charles IV died in 1328 without male descendants, a relative laid claim to the throne, Edward III, King of England and grandson of a French king. But they did not want to award the French crown to an English monarch. Instead, Philip VI from the House of Valois was installed, an act that Edward could not accept. What follows is no simple war of succession, but a century of violence, of change, and of national awakening, the 100 Years' War. What makes the war special is not only its length, 116 years, interrupted by truces and phases of peace, but the way it changed the societies of both countries. Initially, kings like Edward III and his son, the famous Black Prince, led campaigns on French soil with astonishing efficiency. The English were fewer in number, but their tactics revolutionized the battlefield. A prime example is the Battle of Crecy in 1346. The English longbowmen, mostly simple peasants, pierced the armor of the French knights with their arrows. The myth of the invincible nobility shattered. 2 years later, the French king even fell into English captivity. They are moments of glory, but the price is high, for while England celebrates victories, another power spreads in Europe: the Black Death. The plague kills a third of the population, also in England, also among soldiers. Economy, agriculture, society, everything teeters. The wars continue, but morale crumbles and new questions arise. What is a people? To whom does power belong? Where lies the border between royal ambition and the suffering of the subjects? A common misunderstanding is to see the 100 Years' War as an uninterrupted military struggle. In fact, it is a sequence of conflicts connected by a basic theme: England's claim to the French crown. And yet, something unexpected grows out of the war: national consciousness. In France, as in England, a deeper bond to one's own land, one's own language, one's own destiny arises for the first time, beyond dynasties. The last decades of the war are marked by setbacks for England. Joan of Arc, a simple girl from Lorraine, inspires the French and becomes a symbol of resistance. Her story shows not only kings decide the course of history. The lesson from the 100 Years' War: glory is fleeting, and sometimes the greatest change lies not in victory, but in what a people learns about itself. But while the battlefields of Europe slowly fall silent, a new struggle begins on English soil. Not with France, but within. The next conflict will divide brothers: the Wars of the Roses. It is one of the most tragic ironies of English history. Hardly had the decades-long war with France ended when a new one began. This time not against external enemies, but right in the heart of the kingdom. Two powerful noble families, York and Lancaster, both with royal blood, both convinced of having legitimate claims to the crown, plunged England into a bloody civil war. A war that decided not only battles but shook trust in the kingship itself, the so-called Wars of the Roses. Named after the emblems of both houses, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, began in 1455 and were to wear down the political and social fabric of the country for over 3 decades. What began as a dynastic power struggle quickly developed into a war of attrition, in which loyalties changed like the weather, and where no victory seemed permanent. The origins lay deep, Henry V. King from the House of Lancaster was a weak ruler, mentally unstable, politically passive, guided by his power-conscious wife Margaret of Anjou. The dissatisfaction of the nobles grew. Richard, Duke of York, demanded reforms and ultimately the right to the crown. The open conflict did not wait long. Battles like Towton or Tewkesbury left fields full of dead, many of them former brothers in faith, now opponents in the name of honor. A special aspect of this war was its unpredictability. Unlike with clear enemy images like in the 100 Years' War, the fronts here were blurred. Families were split, oaths broken. Allies of yesterday became enemies of today. It was not just a fight for power, but for identity and trust. A frequently made mistake is the assumption that the Wars of the Roses were a clear conflict between two houses. In truth, it was a complex web of personal rivalries, economic tensions, and regional loyalties. And in the end, it was not military superiority that decided, but a clever political move. Henry Tudor, a distant relative of the Lancasters, defeated Richard III in 1485 at Bosworth Field in a battle that was surprisingly small but symbolically massive. With Henry VI, a new dynasty began, the Tudors, and through his marriage to Elizabeth of York, he united the feuding houses, at least on paper. From red and white came the Tudor rose, a new symbol for a united but deeply wounded England. The lesson: power that is not based on trust inevitably leads to division, and peace sometimes needs not just a ceasefire, but reconciliation through connection. But even while the wounds of this war healed, a new king stepped onto the stage, ambitious, educated, charismatic, and ready to steer England in a completely new direction. Henry V, the man who, with a divorce, brought an entire belief system to collapse. When one thinks of Henry V today, one often sees the portrait of a powerful man with a broad-brimmed hat, stern gaze, and 6 wives. But behind the image of a royal hedonist lies much more, namely the beginning of a religious and political earthquake that shook not only England, but all of Europe. And it began quite unheroically with a marital crisis. Henry VI was at the beginning of his reign everything a kingdom could wish for: young, educated, athletic, pious. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his brother, seemed initially happy, but she bore him no male heir. After several miscarriages, only a daughter survived Mary. For Henry, driven by the fear of a renewed civil war as in the times of the Wars of the Roses, a male heir to the throne was existential. His wish to have the marriage annulled and marry Anne Boleyn, a lady in waiting with whom he had fallen passionately in love, but the Pope in Rome refused permission. The reasons were both of a religious and political nature, for Catherine was the aunt of the powerful Emperor Charles V, but Henry would not be stopped. What followed was a break with Rome, not out of theological conviction, but out of dynastic calculation. In 1534, Henry had the Act of Supremacy passed, which declared him, and no longer the Pope, the supreme head of the Church of England. The Anglican Church was born. Monasteries were dissolved, church lands expropriated, resistors like Thomas More executed. England was now formally Protestant, yet Henry himself remained Catholic, influenced in many questions of faith. The Reformation in England was not a spiritual awakening like in Germany or Geneva, but a power project with enormous consequences. A frequently made mistake is to see this development as a purely internal English matter. In truth, it was part of a larger movement. The authority of the Catholic Church was questioned Europe. Wide, new theological models gained ground. But in England, it was the crown that set the direction, not the people, not the reformers. The consequences were profound. The religious split led to decades of uncertainty, persecution, violence, but also to a new self-definition of England as an independent spiritual and political unit. The lesson: great upheavals often begin with very personal decisions, but their consequences reach far beyond the origin. And exactly these consequences Henry's daughter was to feel. A woman who was considered a bastard later became queen and tried to heal the wounds of her father. Her name Elizabeth, and with her begins an era that was to shape the image of England forever. When Elizabeth I ascended the English throne in 1558, the country lay in a sea of doubts. Her half-sister Mary, called Bloody Mary, had left the kingdom in flames of religious persecution. Faith was torn, trust shaken, and many considered Elizabeth an illegitimate pretender to the throne, the child of a divorced mother, born in the shadow of the Reformation. Yet this very woman, who would never marry and never bear an heir, became the mother of a nation. Elizabeth began her rule with caution. She knew of the fragility of her throne. Surrounded by Catholic great powers like Spain and France, threatened internally by intrigues, conspiracies, and denominational tensions. But instead of ruling through hardness, she governed with intellect, charm, and an amazing diplomatic instinct. She created a balance between Protestant doctrine and traditional forms of worship, the so-called via media, a middle way that helped England to stability. Unlike her predecessors, Elizabeth did not rule through dynastic marriages but through clever symbolism. She stylized herself as the Virgin Queen, whose spouse was not a man but the entire people. This decision was not only an act of self-protection, but also a power political signal. England was no longer to define itself through foreign marriage alliances, but through itself. A central moment of her reign was the conflict with Spain. After Elizabeth supported the Protestant Netherlands and had Mary Stuart, the Catholic Queen of Scotland, executed in 1587, Philip II equipped the Armada, a massive fleet, to subjugate England. But storms, tactics, and English courage prevented the invasion. The victory over the Armada became a national myth, a moment in which England understood itself as an independent, unbowed sea power. A common misunderstanding is that Elizabeth's rule was characterized only by peace and cultural splendor. In fact, her time was full of crises, famines, uprisings, economic crises. But her strength lay in dealing with uncertainty. She listened, she hesitated, she decided with care, and she knew that power lay not only in swords but also in words, which shows not least in the flowering of theater and poetry. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spencer, they all found room in this golden age. The lesson a nation can reinvent itself through courage, through moderation, and through trust in its own voice. But even the golden light of Elizabeth could not shine forever. When she died in 1603 without an heir, the throne fell to a new dynasty, and with it began a new chapter, the Stuarts. England was soon to see itself confronted with entirely new questions about power, religion, and the rights of the people. England was never a linear story. No clear rise, no closed narrative. It was a mosaic of foreign rule and self-assertion, of invasion and integration, of tradition and break. And yet something special happened in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Out of the patchwork of past centuries, an identity formed, an idea of what England was, what it wanted to be, and what it was soon to become a world power. With the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, rule passed to the House of Stuart. James I, son of the executed Mary Stuart, became King of England and Scotland, and with him began a new chapter in which questions about rule, religion, and law became ever more pressing. The centuries of external threat now gave way to internal conflicts. The struggle between monarchy and parliament, between Catholic recollection and Protestant identity, between absolute claim and public conscience. But at the same time, England opened up, geographically as well as spiritually. With the founding of the East India Company, the first expeditions to North America, and growing influence at sea, a phase began that was to change England in the long term, the rise to empire. It was no sudden leap, but a slow advance, often economic calculation, sometimes through brutal violence, almost always carried by the consciousness of being different. A decisive factor in this was language. Out of the Anglo-Saxon Norman language mixture, an English had developed that was flexible, absorbing, globally thinkable. In this language, Shakespeare and Newton, Locke and Hobbes found the words for a new world, one in which England was no longer just an island but an idea, An often overlooked aspect of this time is the diversity of origins that shaped England's identity. The Roman roads, the Celtic myths, the Danish place names, the French concepts of law, all that remained, layered over one another, merged into something of its own. The greatest strength of England was perhaps exactly that, to redefine itself again and again without losing itself. A common error is to see England's rise to world power as self-evident or even fateful. In truth, it was the result of political decisions, economic networks, geographical location, but also cultural resilience. England had been vulnerable and had learned from it to protect itself, to assert itself, to connect. The lesson identity is never static. It is the result of conflicts, of encounters, of stories that are passed on and sometimes retold. And with that, this journey does not end. It rather opens a window into the next chapters: colonialism, civil war, industrialization, democracy. But everything that was to come had its origin here, in an island that had learned to form itself. England, a story in motion. History is no solid stone. It is a river that flows, branches out, seeks new paths, and leaves old traces. England, as we know it today, is not a product of a single moment, but the result of centuries of change, from Celts and Romans, from Vikings and Normans, from queens and rebels, from crises of faith and linguistic fusions. What this journey shows us is not only the rise of an island to a world power, but the silent, multi-layered emergence of an identity shaped by diversity, by resilience, by the courage to reinvent oneself again and again. Perhaps therein lies one of the most valuable lessons, that greatness lies not only in conquering, but in listening, in learning, in remembering that national identity is not rigid, but alive like a mosaic of voices, places, and stories. If this journey has touched you, if you have discovered something new or seen the known in a different light, then share this video with others who want to not just learn history, but understand it. Let us carry this look behind the scenes of the past further together, and write to us in the comments which epoch fascinated you the most, or which we should discover together next. Subscribe to the channel if you are in the mood for more history told with heart and depth. For what was yesterday lives in how we think, feel, and act today. And who knows, perhaps the next great chapter begins right now.